Bandwidth for changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com.
I'm Andrew Godwin, and you're listening to The Changelog.
Welcome back, everyone. This is The Changelog, and I'm your host, Adam Stacoviak. This is episode 229, and today Jared and I are talking about Django and Python with Andrew Godwin. Andrew is known for raising money for Django features. We talked about sustainability, a lot of fun stuff around how he's funded open source. We talked about Python, what's new in Python, how to get into Python. We also talked about Django Channels, what they are, how they work, what the status of the project is, and how they compare against Action Cable or Phoenix Channels. We have 3 sponsors today: Heap Analytics, GoCD, and also our friends at TopTal. First sponsor of the show is Heap Analytics. Check out heapanalytics.com/changelog. Heap automates away the annoying parts of user analytics. No manual event tracking, no messy tracking plans, no custom ETL pipelines, just insights for everyone on your team. And I talked with one of their customers, Alan DeSouza, the director of product analytics for lendingclub.com. Alan shared some insights into the value they get from Heap. Take a listen.
Very quickly, we realized that we were not good at anticipating every single question that would come up. We could get questions from different departments about how many people are looking at this agreement on this page, or how many people clicked on this particular link in a 7-day period. 99% of the time, that link actually has no value until that discrete question comes up. And those moments are tough, right? So we really wanted something that addressed that.
Okay, so here you are, you've got Heap installed, very low burden on your engineering team to get in place. You don't have to go through and individually track events or taps or predict the future, basically, but you've got all this data in Heap, and obviously we're all data driven. Talk to me about how you get value from all this data being in Heap.
Data is really hot. Everyone's talking about it. People are creating tons and tons of data. Every tool lets you export raw data and do this and do that. So people have a ton of data, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting anything valuable out of it, or you're able to answer questions or inform your decision-making process using data and incorporate it into day-to-day things. And that's not valuable. What is valuable is the tool that might have large amounts of data in the background, makes it seamless for you to phrase a question and get an answer to that question in real time. What you really need is the tool that is able to work with you and create value out of all this data that might be there in the back end. Heap is the only tool that I've encountered that lets everyone instantly answer business questions.
Very cool. Thanks, Alan, for speaking with me. For the listeners out there who want to check out Heap, go to heapanalytics.com/changelog. Do not Google it. Go to that URL. It's the URL we're getting credit for. heapanalytics.com. Now on to the show. All right, we're back. We got a fun show lineup. It's Python Django Day, Jared. What do you think about that?
Django. I just can't think. I just think about Django Unchained every single time.
Every single time. I don't know if it's been helpful or hurtful to the brand of Django. What do you think?
Or surely the Django project predates Django the movie.
Yeah.
But not in my mind, it doesn't. That's for sure.
We can't talk much further, though. We got to introduce our guest, Andrew Godwin.
Hello.
That's right. Andrew Godwin, thanks for joining us.
No problem. It's my pleasure to be here.
Jared, you should open up with that thing you said your friend said. What was that about?
So the first person that ever introduced me to Django was a fella that pronounced it Django. And when he said it, it's like one of those double takes, like, what'd you say? And he's like, Django. And he was the first person that had ever, said the word to me. And he's talking about the framework. And I was like, it didn't sound right, but I wasn't quite sure. And so I was like, okay. And I kind of rolled with it for a little while. So in my head, I was reading it to Django, but I had a feeling that wasn't it. And kind of just waiting for somebody else to confirm or deny. And then didn't take very long. I have never heard anybody else in the history of my life say it like that ever again.
Would it be somebody else's life?
I guess it would have been. I
Okay.
heard it
So, Andrew, what do you think about that?
How do you say it? You don't say Django, do you?
I definitely say Django. I have heard Django before. One of the jokes when I joined the community was that a good number of people said Django, and there was actually a talk at one of the first Django cons about by a linguist about why it's actually Django, not Django. But yeah, it's definitely more common than you might think.
Django.
Well, see, I think Jared's is different though, because the Django is fine, and that's okay.
Well, yeah,
but the Django,
Well, not if you're a linguist.
it's far
Linguists
fetched.
probably would disagree with the Django as well. But what does the word even mean? I've never even looked it up.
So like the origins of it. It comes from Django Reinhardt, who is a famous gypsy jazz guitarist, and
Okay.
one of the founders of the framework was a big fan of his, and so that's where the name came from. So
Okay.
it's just a name basically.
For some reason, I think about a kangaroo. Is that not is that a different thing?
Not that I'm aware of. No. I mean,
It might be a dingo.
yeah, you've got the two films as well, Django and Django Unchained.
Wow, Jared.
A dingo is a wild dog from Australia.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna be quiet for a while. You let you guys talk.
Dingoes are great.
So, in the interest of getting to good content, Andrew, take us back. We like to get kind of a history of our guests, and obviously we're going to dive deep into Django, not the Django or whatever else you want to say it might be. Take us back into your history. Where did you get in your start in programming or even open source?
Well, so my start in programming was a little bit unusual. I started programming on a Palm Pilot 3X, I think it was.
Wow.
So my mother had a Palm Pilot, and it had a basic interpreter on it. And so I was there on holiday, just like writing basic games with a stylus on a touchscreen, which is the suboptimal way to program in any situation. And I sort of got my start there, like writing like basic like music, keyboard stuff, and basic games, and then from there I kind of branched out into some web stuff. So I've been doing a little bit of HTML around the edges of there, and like going to my local library, because at this I was like, I say 14, 15 at the time. So we had dial-up internet, but the library had proper internet. So I'd go down the road to the library, I'd use their computers, do some websites. And that suddenly sort of morphed into, well, how do I add JavaScript to the website? How do I add some PHP? And then I started doing PHP development. And my very first open source project, which I think is about 2005, 2006, was one called ByteHorde, which is this PHP interface for uploading and downloading files. It was very simplistic, had several rather bad security vulnerabilities in it, which of course is part of the course for your first PHP project. But it was this wonderful feel-good thing, because like I released it open source, and there weren't many, I'd say, in retrospect, moderately well-designed ones at the time. And so I got some people using it, like, an energy company in the Netherlands. Like at some point, some part of NASA said they were using it, which I found kind of crazy when I was a teenager.
Wow.
I think it was just like some tiny broom closet somewhere in NASA, but still, it was fun to hear from somebody over there with a NASA.gov email address. And that's kind of my first experience. Like for about 2 or 3 years, I ran the ByteHorde project, making my PHP skills better, doing some freelancing, but sort of very much a single man open source operation. Just like, it's just me. I'm just fixing these bugs. Did one rewrite to try and fix security holes. It was a lot better after that, thankfully. And then I think it was about, it was 2006 it would have been. I'd just gone to university. During university, I was working part-time in the holidays, in the vacations, at a agency called Torchbox in Oxfordshire. And it was there I met Simon Willison. Simon Willison is one of the co-creators of Django. And if you've ever met Simon, or if you've ever even heard him speak, he is one of the most enthusiastic people I've ever met. And it was about a week and a half of being exposed to his enthusiasm, I'd switched to doing Django rather than PHP at that point. So it was this sort of very sort of tour de force entry into doing Python and Django. And I'd done a bit of Turbo Gears, an old web framework at the time, but like to switch to doing mostly Django was sort of that was the big change, catalyzed by Simon in many ways.
Yeah.
And then so I sort of was doing that, and about 2 years I was just doing Django projects on the side at university. And then it was 2008, I believe. We were sitting down in the agency. We had this problem. We wanted to change our database schema. Django at the time was very bad at this. It made new tables and nothing else. And so me and a friend of mine, a co-worker there, sat down, planned out what we'd like to see in a migrations framework, borrowing something from Ruby on Rails at the time, from Active Record, borrowing some stuff from Java's Hibernate and a few other things. And I made South, the Django migrations framework. And I sort of rewrote it. It worked for our purposes, very, very bare bones. Stuck it up on the internet, published it somewhere. got a pretty reasonable sort of level of interest, I would say. And then I think it was like a couple of weeks later, Jacob Kaplan-Moss, who is another co-creator of Django, emails me. He says, "Hey, Andrew, we have the first DjangoCon happening, I think it was like 4 weeks away at that point in San Francisco. And we have a panel on database migrations. And they had Simon there talking about his one called Demigrations, and Russell Keith McGee talking about his one, which was Django Evolution. He says, would you like to come and talk on the panel? We can fund your flight and get you over here. And by the time I am a student in university, I am not well off by any means at this point. So I go, if you're going to fly me to San Francisco, sure, I will take that offer. And so with a couple of weeks to spare, I book a flight to San Francisco. I foolishly book, I think it was 3 days in the Bay Area for a 11-hour flight from London, which you never do, is my advice. And then flew over here and then did that first DjangoCon. I think that was kind of the trial by fire of my involvement with the Django. And since then, South has got more and more popular and eventually ended up being sort of merged into Django 1.7.
Very cool. So just for the listener's sake, we forgot to mention that Andrew is one of the Django core developers. You're also an engineer currently at Eventbrite.
That's right.
Also, this show was put together in thanks to our Ping repo and a whole host of people who hopped in when Python was mentioned and said, yes, let's do this. So we want to give a shout out to a few people, JL Duggar, DeGustav, Frank Wiles, and Freakboy3742 for helping us line this show up and saying, if we're going to talk about Django, we got to be talking to Andrew Godwin for many reasons, but also the major reason is because of your work on Django Channels, which we'll be talking about in detail upcoming. But what I find interesting about your history is that Django really brought you to Python, and it wasn't like you didn't come to Python for Python. You kind of came for Django, and you stayed for the Python.
Yeah, I had experimented with Python before. It was about that time I was reaching the end of what PHP was capable of. Like PHP 4 was a very limiting language. It's got a lot better since, but back then it was a very limiting language. And so I've been experimenting with different sort of alternative languages. You of course had Java, you had Python. Ruby was a lot more nascent back then. I hadn't really heard of it. Mm-hmm. So I played around a little bit in Python, but Django is really that catalyst that got me to sort of go whole hog into Python. Be like, no, this is the language I'm going to learn, become my primary language. And I, like many people, I think I learned a lot of Python through Django.
Yeah. So interesting. We were talking before the call, Adam and I, and the conversation was kind of like, why would you choose Python? Or I think, Adam, even more generally, your question was like, why do people choose
one language over the other? Yeah.
Yeah. Like he always wonders, like, what's the impetus, the reason? And in your case, it was very much because of a web framework that you liked or wanted to use. But if somebody's getting into Python today, let's say they don't do web, like what are some of the draws of Python, the language? Why somebody might pick it up as their first language or their next language?
Before he answers that, though, I want to pause for 1 second because something he said, Jared, he said primary language. So I think that'd be a good tweak on the question I was asking, which is like, why would they choose a certain language as their primary language?
Okay.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question because, I say primary language. I am very much a person who believes you should choose more than one programming language. Like, use the right tool for the right job. I think Python works very well for the sort of work that I do because, so there are various things. It's very hard to explain. Like, if you've ever seen the Zen of Python, it's sort of like this short poem about what Python really means to be. And things like explicit is better than implicit, for example. So one of the differences that I personally prefer Python over Ruby, say, is that imports are very explicit. You can trace where things happen very easily. But in the majority, it's very much like Python is an easy language to write. It's got a decent typing system that isn't too crazy. Like, it can enforce some stuff, but it's a little bit flexible, but it's not as, say, lax as JavaScript is. It has a good sort of set of data models and built-in stuff. Like the standard library is very useful. A lot of stuff comes with it, and that's true of Django as well, sort of extended out to web stuff. And it's just and the community is really nice. And this sort of combination of all those stuff, there's no one thing, right? It's this sort of bundle of it's nice to use, it's easy to write, it's easy to read, which is a super important thing. I used to write some Perl that is not easy to read at all.
Right.
It's easy to maintain. You can style it pretty well. The combination of all those things, I think, really kept me in the language. I approached it with one thing, and then a whole set of things conspired to say, this is a nice place to be. I enjoy doing this. It's a good. The cycle of writing stuff in this language works really well for me.
I spent about 6 months myself writing Python day by day, and I really enjoyed it. I don't have any problem with significant white space, even being a person who mostly writes Ruby and JavaScript. I like significant white space. It saves on parentheses and curly braces, and it doesn't bug me, but some people just can't get over that. One thing that I loved about it was the documentation, and that just seems like you talk about the community and kind of the overall thing is you add all these things up and you get something that's really nice. And it just seems like the Python community is so documentation oriented or first, or there's this like built-in thing that makes it really easy to pick up. And I didn't know anything about Python coming into it, but I got ramped up very quickly because the docs, both for the language and the standard library, and for anything else you might grab off the shelf, they were all pretty good.
Yeah, it's definitely like a community thing. Like I'd say that Ruby is probably better at testing as community, and maybe Python's a bit better at documentation. But like, it's definitely this thing of like, it is considered like a product isn't even launched till there's like a decent documentation. Like a lot of the solutions for doing good documentation have come out of the Python community, like Sphinx and Read the Docs and stuff like that. Like they're all sort of rooted in Python itself. And that's probably one of the things that got me to stay too, is like as a beginning programmer out in Python going, oh, there's this huge like extensive standard library can be like full of examples as well. Like I'm an example oriented learner, so like that was an amazing thing for me. There were good books as well. I think Dive into Python was a thing I learned at the time that was really good back then. And so like just this whole host of like endless reams of information that you could just turn to. And like even now, like I don't know all the standard library. I know whereabouts in the documentation to look if I forget, right? That's what I learned. Right. It's like, oh, if I want to remember exactly how, say, like ordered dicts work, I can go and look in that part, like the collections page. It's more like having this index of where to look rather than having to know everything offhand.
You mentioned Read the Docs, and it just reminded me of a recent show of Request for Commits, episode 5. I'll just submit that as something that people should go listen to. Eric Holscher came on the show and talked to Nadia and Michael all about Read the Docs and documentation and Write the Docs, which I had never heard of. A very cool conference for technical writers and people who care about documentation, get together, talk about the best ways of doing it, tips and tricks, just this whole community around documentation that's like really refreshing and like seems to be underground in the open source community, at least. Yeah. Like I try to stay abreast of what's going on, and I was like blown away by how much Eric and everybody involved in Read the Docs and Write the Docs have been up to, and many of us don't seem to know about it. So curious your thoughts on Read and Write the Docs, Andrew, and everybody go check out RFC episode 5. It's a good one.
Yeah, like to me, it's a really important thing. Like I have turned into a documentation first developer. Like you might say like testing first, whatever. Like I will generally, like especially with like channels, we'll discuss later, I wrote down the entire sort of basic documentation API I wanted to give to people before I actually wrote the code. Like the idea being that like that's kind of my UX, right? That's how how would I, as like being my own devil's advocate, want to approach a project I'd never seen before? Like, how would I want to be introduced to that thing? What would I expect to see? How should things behave? And like, for me, writing documentation and getting that down on paper is not both a great way of telling other people, it's a great way of like getting yourself to be on the right track and understanding what you're doing and sort of cementing what you're trying to work on.
It reminds me of something Jameis Buck said years ago about how he designs libraries, because he's a Ruby developer, amongst other things, and wrote like Capistrano and NetSSH and a whole bunch of tooling and libraries in the Ruby world. And he was talking about the way he goes about building these projects. Like, where do you start with? And of course, we've had the movement README driven development, which is kind of along the lines of documentation driven, but it's like if all your docs can fit in the README, that's good. A lot of times you need to go beyond that, but he said like he always designs the API first. Like he wouldn't write any code. Like he would think, how would I want to use this?
Right.
And he designs the library API. And the beauty about the Ruby language is it is so flexible, and the DSLs are so easy to craft that you can come up with like what is a fun and beautiful to use API, and then you back into the code once you have the API finished. And it seems like it's a very similar idea that you're talking about, where it's like, if I'm writing the actual documentation first for this library or this tool that I'm building, I get to think about it as the end user, the person who's coming to it and reading the docs and saying, is this going to be what I need or not? And then I can go and fill in the gaps with the code. I think it's a really powerful way of building things.
Right. And like even in Python, like Python is less flexible than Ruby, but you still have a lot of flexibility. Like there's still meta programming, there's still like various tricks like that. And so generally, like in my perspective, like part of it is the principle of least surprise. And so an API should still be like what we call Pythonic. It should still like not be full of like crazy hacks or like it's full of declarative classes that magically work. Like magic is a bad word, but like say part of it is like an API that is both nice to use, but also like is similar to other stuff and is not very surprising and is like easy to debug. And so like, there's a whole sort of spectrum of different things I would consider, but part of that is documentation and like trying to write down like how would you run this, how would you test this, how would you deploy this, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's like Kenneth Wright has made himself, very famous, not just in the Python community, but in the programming community, the open source community, because of how great, the APIs he's created around HTTP requests. And a lot of that, honestly, is like, he does a really great job of documenting that and like selling it as a thing that you'd want to use. And so that's an example, I guess, of a success story inside of just caring a lot about your documentation.
Well, what exactly do you classify as documentation? Simply where you go to learn about how to use it, or like getting started guides? Where does documentation begin and end?
I'd say there's a whole different set of things. Like you've got reference documentation, which is usually things like, oh, here are the methods, here's the errors you can raise, and here's things you can call. And that's usually like at the end of a project, I would write that stuff. It's like, well, this is the exact spec of what you should expect. Like, these are the 4 errors this function could raise, like, and this is the set of scenarios. And then there's more sort of an overarching guide, which would be like sort of almost an architectural overview or like an introduction of like what the thing is, what it's trying to achieve, and the sort of the concepts. And that's kind of what I put in the getting started guide / sort of introductory end of stuff. And so I'd usually probably write a getting started or tutorial first, like the goal being that a novice programmer should be able to use the thing I'm writing, or rather someone with no experience of the domain I'm writing in should be able to use it. But generally I try and think of like, I want any programmer to come along and be able to use this and not only be able to use it and get stuff done, but make it really hard for them to shoot themselves in the foot, which is a very important part of writing a library. So like how can we make it nice but safe, and like approaching it from that end generally. But yeah, there's definitely a couple of different aspects. There's this reference, and even release notes are important too. Like release notes are this sort of temporal documentation, like what's changing in a project, like what do I have to do when I upgrade? And like a lot of projects don't have good release notes, and that does sometimes irk me a little bit.
I think sometimes, as a maintainer, you might get so focused on the future and where you're going, you kind of forget where you came from and maybe how you're currently using whatever it might be. And this is totally just a abstract example, but sometimes you just forget, like, how do you go from one version to the next, or a bigger upgrade, or move from one version to the next. It's just a larger transition than maybe before.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem you have. Like, one of the things of being an open source maintainer that I did not really appreciate before I was one was that it is very difficult to see the wood for the trees, as to use a phrase. Like it's very difficult to understand the external perspective. Like you're always living in the most current code with all the current bugs, all the issues being filed. Like the perspective of somebody who's like, oh, they're like on 2 versions behind, their site's stable, they want one new feature you've just announced. Like that's a very different perspective, and getting a good insight into what that perspective is sometimes very difficult for an open source. But that's also crucial to have. Like and having been on both sides of the fence, like having used open source as well as maintaining it, I try and think about like what I appreciate in when I use open source tools and try and provide at least as much as that I can myself.
Well, I think it's a natural place to take our first break. On the other side, we will dive into Django. What's new? What's the flagship features of Django? Why would you want to use it from Andrew's perspective, as well as a deep conversation on Andrew's baby, which is Django Channels. So we'll be right back, and we'll talk about those things after this break.
Our friends at ThoughtWorks have an awesome open source project to share with you. GoCD is an on-premise, open source, continuous delivery server that lets you automate and streamline your build, test, release cycle for reliable continuous delivery. With GoCD's comprehensive pipeline modeling, you can model complex workflows for your team with ease, and the value stream map lets you track a change from commit to deploy at a glance. The real power is in the visibility it provides over your end-to-end workflow, so you can get complete control of and visibility into your deployments across multiple teams. To learn more about GoCD, visit go.cd/changelog for a free download. It is open source. Commercial support is also available, and enterprise add-ons as well, including disaster recovery. Once again, go.cd/changelog. And now back to the show.
All All right, we are back with Andrew Godwin, and we're here to talk about Django. So, Andrew, let's kick it off like this. Many of our listeners have used Django, many have not. We have lots of web developers. We have a whole group of listeners out there, and they're coming from different perspectives. So let's just start off kind of with a high level of what Django is and does in 2016, and then we'll kind of drill down from there. So what are the flagship or the major features of Django as a web framework? I know one of them, which I've always been jealous of, is a built-in admin, but surely there's lots of other things it does for you. So give us the rundown on what Django looks like today.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, as you said, the main one and sort of our main star attraction that everyone gets someone into the project is the admin. And that's sort of the thing that when it was launched was the big thing. Like, so basically the idea is Django has this fully featured ORM that sort of you declare models. It has migrations on those models. You can declare custom field types. It has a very extensible like query framework, all this kind of stuff. But like you declare your models and then it just makes an admin for you. And that's one of the big sort of get developing fast features. It's like, oh, we can just take the admin and then we can just like immediately put things into the database and play around with it. And some sites even run with the admin in production, although usually you want to try and do something a little bit different. But there's many other features as well. So one of my favorite ones is the GIS framework, which is a little less known maybe.
Okay.
But Django has a very extensive, very powerful GIS framework for doing geospatial data or queries, all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's built into the ORM if you want it. So you can say like, oh, find me all posts that were made inside this polygon. It just it's all in there and integrated. So that's super nice. It has other things too. So it has a forms framework for doing display stuff. Its own templating language with extensibility as well. It has a views and URL routing framework. Sort of all the pieces you expect from a web framework, really. Of like, you can make URLs, you can route them, you have views. It has what we call generic views, which sort of take some of the replication out of doing so. Like, oh, if you want to just have a view, which is like, just accepts a form and saves it, there's built-in code for that already, and all this kind of stuff. I'm trying to think of other stuff it has.
Great documentation.
Obviously, yes, of course, great documentation. I mean, that's kind of, I just kind of assume that, right? That's kind of just part of like, oh yeah, of course, there's great documentation. This is part of my but of course, Django has this. Not only is there a Django tutorial, there is full like prose, like article style documentation on every major feature we have, and reference documentation. And there's excellent other, so like the Django Girls tutorial is an excellent like second tutorial apart from the Django one as well. So there's a really good culture of documentation around that. And also there's a lot of sort of security considerations. Django has a lot of like CSRF protection built in, like has places to put like cookie protection and HSTS and all this stuff. We have things called middlewares. There's a security middleware where you can say, is my site secure? And it has run some checks for you. There's a command where you can check for common errors. And so like all of that stuff is bundled up into sort of one set of stuff. But one of the things I think is most important about Django, and the thing I try and stress, especially to people who are maybe new to Django or don't use it a lot, is that one of the key features is that not only has it got all these components, but you can individually remove each component. They're all optional. So if you don't want the admin, it's a couple of lines to turn it off. If you don't want to use templates, you can swap in another one straight away. It's super easy. And so part of what Django's appeal to me has been over the last sort of 8-9 years I've been using it is the ability to, as I grow projects, I can replace the generic parts of Django with bits that are custom or slightly customize them. And like, I don't have to just throw the whole thing away. It's very loosely coupled. And so I can say, oh, I want to use Ginger rather than Django templates here. I can just swap, do a little bit of work, swap it out, and it all works pretty well. So that's what I personally appreciate a lot about Django. It's like when you get to that point, it steps away and like sort of falls away, and then you can put your own thing in place.
Let's hop back to the GIS feature because that really caught my ear. Is that tied to us? Like, is that using PostGIS or is it using a specific backend? How's that whole thing fit together? How's it work?
Also, much like Django has pluggable database backends, the GIS framework does as well. So it supports Postgres, it supports Oracle, it supports MySQL. There may be more support as well, but like those are the three I know about. But it has support for multiple backends, and it has like Oracle and PostGIS especially. They are fully featured geospatial databases, and as is the newer MySQL as well. And it just supports all of those functionality out of the box, pretty much. It's just like you install a few libraries that are a little bit arcane.
Right.
Once you've got that done, it's pretty much plug and play.
Yeah, I've used PostGIS a handful of times and via Rails, and I think directly a couple times, and it's always a little bit of wiggle this and pull that lever over there to get everything all working together. But you can do amazing things once you have it up and running. So it's really cool that it provides kind of a adapter pattern to those type of queries and lookups inside of the framework. That's pretty sweet.
Yeah, and even better, like, keeping with the theme, it has admin widgets. So like, if you make a point field or a polygon field and load the admin up, you get a map with a polygon on it. You can drag around and edit. So like, it's all that. You can just like start using it straight away. Like, oh, I want to see what's my shape of London look like, and the admin will just show you on a map, which is super nice.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Django came out of a newspaper, correct, in Lawrence, as far as where it was born, and so it's kind of very much in that community of like online publishers and newspapers, these types of companies. I believe Eventbrite's using it. It makes sense since you work there. But who else is using Django? Like, what's the community look like, and the companies and the organizations that are involved in the greater Django community?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, like Lawrence Journal World, the Lawrence newspaper was the first place Django was created and born out of and open sourced from. And it had initially a big traction in publishing newspapers, but these days it's pretty well spread. I'd say the biggest one you've probably heard of is Instagram. Instagram runs on Django as a backend. That's sort of the biggest one we have that we know about. There may be other ones we don't know about. Generally, knowing what things run Django is interesting. But obviously, like Eventbrite runs it as well. I'm very bad at knowing the list of companies who run Django. It's one of my goals. I know that like a decent number of government agencies like run at least some Django as well. Let's see. 1 second here.
That's all right. I didn't tell you to think about it. I put you on the spot. Should have prepped you. But I just thought of the question because I just wanted to kind of, it's nice to get an idea, not just like, hey, how many big companies use this as like a street cred, but just to kind of get an idea of what the community looks like in terms of participants and support. Obviously, it's huge. And you guys have Django Con, and you have, it's a long running project that thousands and thousands of people are using. But no, I think that's a good enough idea. Don't need to bang your head too much against knowing which sites run on Django.
Yeah. So what ones I can now like remember.
I've got some too because I went to Wikipedia.
Having maybe just like used to be typing just then. So among other things, I believe parts of Pinterest at least used to run on Django. I'm not sure they still do. Parts of Spotify certainly used to, and also like a lot of Firefox and the Mozilla sites run on Django as well. Like the whole of add-ons at Mozilla.org. I think increasingly more and more of all the Mozilla sites run on Django as well.
Now, the ones on Wikipedia are Pinterest, as you mentioned, Instagram, as you mentioned, Mozilla, as you mentioned, then also the Washington Times, Discuss, Bitbucket, and Nextdoor. Oh,
yes, of course, Nextdoor, yeah.
Nextdoor.
I think NASA does as well. He's part of NASA runs on Django.
Is it Nextdoor is it a mobile app, or is there also a website? Maybe it's just running their API?
Maybe an API thing. It's one of the things with Django, right, is that Django it's not easy to tell as long as a Django site. Like, there's no obvious giveaways. Like, Django is this flexible backend framework. So there's no like, like say WordPress, you could usually tell from the URL structure or something. But Django is like, well, anything could be Django. And increasingly, a lot of things use Django as a backend or as an API for a native app or a rich JavaScript web app and something like that. And so sometimes the site won't even look like Django at all, but behind the scenes, there's a lot of Django churning away to just like serve everything behind, and get it all. Like Discuss, for example, Discuss is mostly embedded, of course. But the whole Django thing there is like the API is driving all these embedded comments and JavaScript systems they're using. And so a lot of Django is like this sort of secret, like behind the scenes, getting stuff done kind of approach that, and we're all quite fine with that. Like Django core developer community kind of like, we take pride in that we are a slightly boring, predictable framework. That's kind of a point of pride for us. It's like, like, I don't know, if you want something that's like stable and reliable, like Django is a very like decent choice these days. And like personally, especially, I take a lot of pride in that.
It kind of touches a little bit on what Jared and I talked about earlier, which wasn't really like back to that choosing the language. We talked a bit about, Django in terms of, in Python in terms of, I guess, buzz, so to speak. And it seems like that community seems to be more focused on stability, as you just mentioned, versus like banging out brand new things and all this new stuff, similar to how JavaScript is just always new. Something's always new. And there's a lot of fatigue in that arena.
Well, I mean, part of it is the age of the language too, right? Like JavaScript as a development community, like JavaScript is an old language by itself, but sort of the modern community around it is still quite young, and like all the tooling and all that kind of stuff is still developing. Python is, several decades old at this point, and like when I joined Python, there was still like some of that sort of buzz and like different options going around, and there still is in certain arenas too. But like, there's now sort of this happy medium between like, well, we still have new stuff coming out and things still happen that are interesting. Like async IO was one of the big things in like Python 3.5, for example. But at the same time, there's also this sort of stability and predictability, and also like this history of Python. Like Python is now so old that like big enterprise companies and universities will happily use it and teach it. And so we have this whole spectrum of like from novice to very experienced programmers, from single developers to entire like huge enterprises using it. And like that kind of diversity of use is, I think, actually a really positive factor in what drives Python forward. And I think JavaScript especially will get there as it sort of matures and people, and it'll go through the same process, and we'll get to the same place.
It's just funny that you said the word boring, and I wonder if your counterparts that are core team members with you, or users of Django, or participants in the Python community will appreciate or agree.
Certainly some of them will. I don't speak for everyone, of course, but like,
can't make everybody happy.
But certainly, like, I would say one of the things I can say is that in the Python community, the word magic is frowned upon. Like if something is magic, it's considered bad. And so in my mind, the opposite of magic is like boring and predictable, or at least like, very obvious. And so that's kind of what I aspire to, is like this software is predictable and easy to deploy and easy to understand and does the thing it says. And it's not terribly exciting, but it will save you a lot of time in your daily work. Like that's what I really appreciate, like as I develop as a programmer, especially.
Well, I think what makes that choice too, like we said before, choosing that language, is that if you're choosing something with more fatigue, so to speak, with more bleeding edge, more modern, well, however you want to phrase that, you can expect some bumps. But if you need something to go smooth, you need something that's going to not drive you crazy, that's going to have clean, good documentation, or even good tutorials to get started, then what you said there was a good example of the right choice.
Yeah, and of course it doesn't hold entirely true. Like Python, so the Python 2 to 3 change was a big overhaul, and that's one of the most major things in recent history of Python. It's like, this was a big change. It broke a lot of stuff. It was perhaps done the wrong way. Some people now consider, things like that. And so like, you're not free from that kind of stuff. And, in the same way, I'd say that a brand new language, you're probably going to find like more recent posts about it, more recent sort of developments and tutorials. But as you said, they do get outdated quicker as well as things move faster. So it's definitely sort of a balance of those kind of things. And part of what I'm trying to do with Django is trying to like find where that balance is, and like where is the balance between keeping things predictable and then pushing forward. What is the state of the art? Like how do we advance as well?
Interesting.
Well, speaking of state of the art and advancements, we do want to talk about Django Channels, which is kind of seems to be the most exciting thing going on in the Django community right now, and something that you're heading up. We are hitting our next break, so let's tee up Channels, and we'll talk all about them after this break.
I talked to Daniel Reed, head of design at TopTal, about their new expansion into TopTal Designers, doing for designers what they've done for developers. We talked about why TopTal works for designers, and this is what she had to say.
As a designer, or as any kind of creative person, the big overarching question is always like, how can you find inspiration? And for me personally, and for a lot of creatives that I've spoken to, it's really about traveling, exploring, and being accountable for your own career. And I think as a TopTal designer or a remote designer in general, the ability to be able to switch up your lifestyle, change contexts, meet new people, have new ideas sort of infiltrated into your life by having that freedom and flexibility is something that's absolutely fundamental to doing great work. That's the real power of TopTal, I feel. You're not just stuck with one product, one company, or even one agency, but you can choose to work on multiple occasionally or a range of different clients. And I think that keeps you fresh. It gets you involved in new technologies, different people, and is really fundamental for being sort of switched on as a designer.
All right, that was Daniel Reed, head of design for TopTal. To learn more, go to toptal.com/designers. That's TOPTAL.com/designers. Tell him Adam from the Changelog sent you. And now back to the show.
All right, Andrew, let's talk about Django Channels. Seems like these days, most web frameworks are either adding channels as a feature or they're trying to. Some of them started off with channel support. But you talked about boring, and I don't think channels are boring. I think the general public is very interested, and by general public, I mean our general public, not the people on Main Street, but the developers. We're interested in channels because it's it provides a new way of interacting and some new features. There's lots to it, and like you said, I guess during the break, it is a lower level kind of a behind the scenes thing, but lots of excitement around Django Channels. So tell us, give us the short history of the channels bit, because I believe it started as a plugin or something, and perhaps it's being integrated, but you know what you're talking about. Why don't you give me the rundown and I'll quit talking?
Of course. So yeah, Channels is actually stems from about 3 or 4 years ago. So I'm sure your audience are aware of this, but if they're not, WebSockets came onto the scene about 5 or 6 years ago. It's sort of like this, we need bi-directional communication for the web, like HTTP is not good enough. And so like a team of developers at the various browser manufacturers, sort of, mainly Google, in fact, was sort of developing this protocol of like, well, what kind of protocol should we have? How's it going to work? How are we going to encode it? It has to like start HTTP. And it's like, I was following at the time, like this development, like what is WebSockets? How is it going along? And back then I was actually using a Python framework called Eventlet, which is sort of a asynchronous programming framework for Python. And they had a WebSocket library, and the spec was changing pretty much every month at that point. And so I put a few patches in to try and like keep it with the current spec. They like found security holes and found like replay attacks and stuff. But then my history is about 3-4 years ago, I think it stabilized pretty much. And then I sort of got interested in like, well, as the web evolves, we see like this trend towards websites being much more of like a heavy like application, like, single page applications is often one of the buzzwords you hear. And like website is this application, it's full of logic, it has to communicate with the backend server. And a lot of that's still being done over REST, over normal HTTP. And that's great. That works really well for a lot of stuff. I appreciate the boringness of that. It's very well understood. But for some things, it just doesn't work. So an example to say from my real place of work at Eventbrite, there's a seat map, what you can pick seats from. And the seats like gray off in real time as they're picked, right? Like if we did that using HTTP, we'd have to sit there doing long polling and bundle it up on the back end and make sure it's all done efficiently. And we did used to do that as well. But the key thing is like WebSockets give you this really easy, quick, like efficient way of sending data backwards and forwards to and from the browser. Like it's this sort of it's not standardized. It's a very slightly crazy protocol on the wire. But pretty much it is a datagram based protocol. You can send and receive packets. That's pretty much it. There's a lot of stuff under the scenes. And it got bigger and bigger. And like I saw it as like, well, obviously, as these applications get bigger and more complicated, they obviously will require more and more communication with the back end. And at some point, sockets make sense. And then Meteor comes along, and Meteor is the thing I see and go, like everyone else, like, this is a really clever way of doing this, right? Meteor is this sort of great idea of like, we can use sockets to do data binding and send data both directions across the socket. And so I think Meteor was the spark for me initially of like, we could do that in Django maybe. And then the problem is, of course, that for the listeners who aren't aware, Python is a single-threaded language at its core. Like we have a threading model, but the threading model is just time sharing on a single core. There's no actual multi-threading in there. And on top of this, like support for what's called asynchrony, as in you can open lots and lots of like virtual threads and wait on sockets and do things out of order, only came in Python 3.5. And so Django supports Python 2.7 and up. So we have the limitation there, like, well, Python has to support, Django has to support all these different versions of Python. And in addition, when I was thinking about this a couple of years ago, async wasn't even mature yet. And so for a little while, Aymeric Augustin, one of the core developers of Django, did some work with WebSockets with Django, and his work was really quite good. Like he had a game of life where every cell in the game of life was an open WebSocket, which was actually kind of amazing. I really enjoyed that demo. And I sort of did that, and like he moved on from that, but it was still like a really nice proof of concept. And then about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I sort of Django migrations, which had previously been my baby, as you would, was done, like merged. Some other core developers had very kindly taken up a lot of the mantle of maintaining it. I got a bit burnt out merging it in the 1.7 release. And so I sort of, I was still helping out occasionally with migrations, but I was thinking, well, what else is Django missing, right? Like I spent 8 years fixing this big hole in Django that I saw in 2006. What do I do now? And so I sat down and thought, well, in my opinion, and what I'm excited about is WebSockets. I'm excited about these things in the browser. Like I also do game development on the side. Sometimes I'm like, well, can we do games in the browser? Like, what's that look like? Like, we obviously need sockets for that, for like proper real-time communication. And so I sat down and started like sketching out sort of like a prototypical, like, how would this API work? Like, how would I want it to work? And then seeing, could I do this with Django? Could I do this with Python even? And it's difficult. Like, there are solutions out there already, and there always have been for a long time, that rely on a separate process running, that process is using a asynchronous framework, be it Twisted or Tornado or Async.io or G-Event or one of the many other ones that Python has. And that framework is capable of handling the idea of lots of simultaneous connections. And if you have this framework running a separate process, that can handle WebSockets, and then everything's good, and it sort of communicates somehow with the main server over some kind of socket, and then you can get sort of socket support, but it's not properly there. And there are a lot of downsides to this solution. Like, the first thing is that server generally only handles WebSockets. You can't just point your server at that server. You got to have like Nginx in front, and then have like path-based routing. Like, well, if you see the path/WS, go to the WebSocket server. Otherwise, go to the main server. It gets a bit tricky. And on top of that, another part of it is HTTP2. And like, WebSockets are not the only thing changing in the web. Like, HTTP2 is also coming in, and it's coming in force. And it's been a slow build, but it's getting there. And H2 also has a lot of changes in terms of how things are served. Like, it no longer has this pure request response model that HTTP has. Like, HTTP is great. Like, you get a request, you single-threadedly handle the request, you return a response, and then you just return to the top of the loop and keep going. It's easy to write. CGI sorted this like many, many decades ago. It's an understood paradigm. And then HTTP2, like, part of it, you can have concurrent requests that you can sort of work out with some like multiple server processes, but it also has things like you can push information from the server in real time, and like other things and all this sort of brings on the same like feeling and texture. Like, well, this is all real time stuff that is no longer a request response cycle. And at that point, I sort of sat down and went, well, let's think bigger than WebSockets. Like, what would it take to bring Django to be a general protocol framework? Like, what would it take to handle HTTP1, HTTP2, WebSockets, like Internet of Things protocols coming up as well. Like, there's several of those. They're very lightweight, of course, because it's the Internet of Things is very limited with bandwidth. But like, those also have API servers, and like, what do we do for those? And like, trying to envision this plan of like, what would it take to build a framework, or like build into Django a framework for the future of the web, the future of the internet? Like, how do you write a system that handles all these different protocols and styles of communication while still being like Django? And that's kind of the track I settled on back when I started Channels.
This doesn't sound boring at all.
No.
Well, it's all infrastructure, right? And I find infrastructure really interesting, but some people find it very
future
boring.
of the web is what you said. The future. You're building the future of the web here.
Well, I have the ability to make it sound very exciting. How about that?
You're succeeding.
You need a hype person behind you, like that Geico commercial. No, it's Progressive. There's like a hype man behind that behind Flow.
He has them. I've seen them out there on the web.
My PR team is here behind me giving me advice, so I'll defer to them on that stuff. But yeah, it's I like big challenges, right? So that's what I'm attracted to as a developer. Like, as I've grown as a developer, I've gone more and more towards the sort of like software architecture / networking / infrastructure end of stuff, and so that's always held my interest. And Channels is very much the idea of like, well, how do we do this? And for the longest time, I couldn't do it. Like, I kept doing ideas, none of them worked, or they were ugly, or they performed really badly, which even if it looks nice, if it performs like way worse than Django, it's not worth doing. And then eventually the current design for Channels I hit on about a year and a half ago now, I would say. Sat on it for a while, like sat there trying to prototype it and test it and like going, is this really okay? Does it really work? And then like asked a few like close developer friends of mine saying like, can you like double check this and make sure I'm not crazy or like overestimating this? And then finally, like when I was happy that it was like at least only a little less performant and had all the features and seemed to map into Django, did I go, okay, I want to talk about this thing and here's my design.
And when was that?
So that would have been probably, it was June 2015. So, a little over a year ago, I posted this first blog post about, this is what I think the challenge facing Django is. The blog post is called Beyond Request Response. That's kind of my sort of encapsulation of the whole thing. Like, this is what I want to do. This is my rough outline. And then sort of, it starts with a proposal to the Django community of like, this is the major fundamental change to the way Django works I would like to do. And it's changed the way Django runs views. And like that's where the discussion started. Like, well, Andrew has this crazy idea. Let's talk about it. And then at Django Under the Hood that year in November 2015, I wasn't talking, but like a good half the talk seemed to at some point mention channels. I think at that point I sort of like had some idea that it may have been like a very popular thing, like sort of like this growing already like interest in it and like what it could mean for Django was really starting to bubble up then.
Let me push back a little bit and play devil's advocate, because let me just say, first of all, I get excited about WebSockets too, and I write web apps, for a living, but I've never actually had to use them, and I don't do games, so I'm not saying there aren't use cases. I just feel like, could we get away with long polling like maybe 95% of the time, and then like sure, like Slack needs to do WebSockets, but the rest of us we can get by with long polling, can't we?
Oh, absolutely. I still recommend it. For like, some people come to me for advice saying, oh, like, what should I use sockets for? Like, no, this is probably a long polling thing, or like, especially with HTTP2. So a little bit of background, H2 does not have WebSocket support because they maintain that chunked responses are enough. Like the protocol is efficient as itself, but just sending requests and responses is as good as WebSockets is. And that's why Channels is not just a WebSocket library. It's a general asynchronous library. Like long polling still requires the ability to hold open hundreds of connections at once that are all waiting on that long poll. And so the same challenges apply to long polling. They apply to having like hundreds of HTTP2 connections at once. Like the same kind of basic structure applies. Like I'm very aware that WebSockets is a very niche thing. It's not for every site. Maybe it could be if the JavaScript frameworks and we get a good pattern for that kind of stuff, like binding it into the models in the JavaScript side. But at the same time, like it's also this extreme of a whole spectrum of, well, there are all these challenges, and just serving normal HTTP one after the other is like the simplest thing. And like we've moved beyond that. Like long polling itself is already difficult. And I think WebSockets and HTTP2 are just the next step of that.
Yeah. So is Django typically run on port 80, or is it behind a proxy of some kind? I'm assuming there's people doing it both ways, but what's a typical way of running a Django in production?
Yeah, it depends on the way you work. Like either you can run it embedded in like Apache with ModWhiskey, for example, or you can run a separate server, like much like you would with another, like say like a JavaScript server or Ruby server, and then proxy to that through your web server. So, for example, Unicorn is a very popular server that you just run. It listens on a port, and then you just proxy through to that stuff as well. And so Channels stays with the latter model of saying like, well, here is a separate server you run that accepts both HTTP1, HTTP2, and WebSocket connections, and you can just proxy everything through to it and just forget about the rest of it. Or if you want to, you can switch different versions and so on and so forth.
Yeah, because I would think like it seems like H2, and maybe it's because I don't know the intricacies very well, even though we had Ilya come on the show and tell us all the intricacies, but that was a long time ago and I can't remember. But it seems like, can't that be something that you could implement at a proxy layer and then just keep your backend, dumb or simple, and like let your Nginx do your H2 stuff, and like you can talk to it with H1 proxied?
Of course. Yeah, so like you definitely can do that. It depends on what features you want, right? So the headline feature you might want from HTTP2 is that you can streamline multiple requests down the same single open socket to the web server. And if you're just doing that, then yes, you can just tell Nginx to take that, proxy it through as 3 separate requests to your backends to 3 separate servers, and it will handle all that stuff for you. However, if you want the more advanced stuff of like, well, we want to send long polling chunk responses, we want to do server push, which is a feature of HTTP2, that stuff requires native support in your framework. Like you can't, like because they're not in the HTTP1 abstraction, you can't just sort of paper them over. You have to have like native support for that stuff to pull it off.
That makes sense. And then probably like the server push aspect of H2 is why they say that you don't need WebSockets anymore, because you can still achieve the bidirectional communication that WebSockets affords. Is that the case?
That's a common misconception, at least as far as I know. So server push, as specified, at least from what I've read, I may be wrong on this, is just a way of pushing resources to the browser before it asks for them. So think, for example, if you're loading a web page, you'd server push the images, the CSS, and a few other things. So by the time it got to the full web page, it would go, oh, all these things are already in my cache and will just immediately serve them. The idea of doing sort of pushing things to browser as responses is more just like you can have a open response and send things down in a chunked fashion, which is like server-sent events. I think would maybe the sort of more common way you describe that. That's also a HTTP 1.1 thing as well.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I think just difficult naming there with server push. So what are the features in H2 that obviate the need for WebSockets?
So I mean, as far as I am personally on the fence here. I kind of think they would still be useful. Like WebSockets have a lot of nice things about them, but the argument goes that because you have efficient chunk responsing, like server-sent events, that's your server to browser part of the direction, as you were.
Okay.
And then because requests are so much more efficient, like headers are compressed properly, and like there's all binary protocol that you can just send normal AJAX requests to the server, and that counts as your inbound.
Okay.
And that's just enough, And maybe it is.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm looking at for channels is like things like abstractions like socket.io and stuff like that, and sock.js of like, is there a good way we can implement those same abstractions and reuse those libraries and have a layer that lets you switch between both of those implementations? And maybe you're just sticky to one for performance reasons, but maybe you want all of them for compatibility.
So give us the status of channels, where it stands in terms of development and involvement. Like, is it in Django? Is it a module that you do use? Give us the rundown on where it stands.
Yeah, so right now it is a separate application. I wouldn't say so. We usually call things third-party applications that aren't part of Django, but that's not true of Channels, because Channels is part of the Django project. So it is a first-party pluggable application. So basically, it's a separate library install. You put it into your installed app setting in Django, which is where you put apps that are loaded in, and then it just works. Like it sort of overrides the server stuff for you, and then you can just import and start using it. And so it's done this way for a reason. So I did propose to put it into the current release of Django 1.10, but there were some very rightful questions raised about like the design and how relatively immature it was at like less than a year old. And so I made the call at that point to keep it out of Django and develop it as a sort of third-party pluggable thing. And then maybe in a future release, we'd look to merge it in much the same way that South got merged in to become Django migrations in Django 1.7.
Okay. One last question for you, just with regard to kind of the ecosystem of channel implementations across these different frameworks. So feel free to dodge this one if you aren't familiar with like how Phoenix does channels or how Rails' Action Cable works. But if you are familiar with those two at least, or any of the others, and how they're going about implementing channels in their frameworks, how is Django Channels different or better? It seems like at least the scope is larger because it's got the H2 aspect of it, but I'll let you answer it.
Yeah, so the major difference to a lot of the common ones is that it is a scope thing. And like part of that is making up for Python's deficiencies. So some other languages already have a good solution for handling asynchronous I/O, and certainly Python 3.5 does as well. But the idea of like, how do you write, because Django is a synchronous framework. Like making Django asynchronous would be a massive like undertaking. So we can't do that, at least in the short term. And so the difference there is like it's much more of an overarching design of like, how do we run a system that is asynchronous across multiple different machines? Like Channels is by its very nature network transparent. So if you're familiar with Go at all, like Go channels are kind of like one of the patterns Django Channels is modeled after. Like the idea of like, it is a data structure you put things into, stuff comes out of the other end, and it does like thread pooling properly. And the idea was that even if you have a language that supports multiple processors, that's still not good enough for most websites. Most websites are like these whole racks of servers, or loads of machines in this huge cluster. And I guess Channels, the idea was to have a design that would enable you to write asynchronous systems across a network. And in that way, it's a very ambitious project in that way. Like at the base of it, it's a distributed like communication and queuing system. Like the Django part of it is sort of the nice, sort of pretty WebSocket build on top, but underneath there is a whole underlying set of libraries that are separate libraries if you want to use them of. This is how you can do asynchronous coordination and communication between different processes. And it's all based on a language called CSP, which is a sort of old academic proof language for concurrent programming, which I got taught at university, much to my regret then, and now much to my it's much better for me now actually using it. But like it's all sort of based on this like idea of like, how do we write a system that handles all of this stuff together? And like in that sense, it's a bit more far-ranging than other solutions, but also some other solutions don't have to have, like, they don't have to solve the same problems in their language, say, that some other things do. But then again, all languages ultimately, apart from, say, maybe Erlang, are fundamentally single machine. And so
Right.
I think the problem still applies to other languages. And like, one of the things I would love to do if it proves out and works well is like look at how we could have intercompatibility across languages with this kind of like message passing solution. Like, could there be a way here of a more general protocol of like making things talk to each other, and then like maybe solving some of the microservices headache people have? Like, well, we can write this thing in other languages, and so on and so forth.
Well, it's no wonder to me that so many people are excited about your channels project, even though you keep using the word boring. I would say it seems exciting and ambitious as well. Any final thoughts on channels before we move on to the next topic?
I think I just want to say is like, if people are looking at channels, like I'd like them to look at the idea like just like, the thing I want to say really is channels probably isn't for everyone. Like one of the many things, like migrations when I wrote it was for everyone. Like almost every company has a database with schemas in it. Real-time communication is not for everyone. But what I would like people to think about is like not just WebSockets, but like as their company grows, as they expand out, like will you grow dedicated hardware or will you grow other things? Like think about things that will go beyond like your just normal web request response model. Like just start thinking about like what would that look like? You know, as Eventbrite, as a company, we move into like actual physical hardware and stuff like that as well. Like we have this problem, but even like the Internet of Things is coming up and all that kind of stuff. Like we have a growing set of problems of like things aren't just normal browsers anymore. They're not just like, you know, IE4 sends a request, gets a response, job done. Like, and just like try and bear in mind like what's the best tool for that job.
Well said. So switching gears a little bit, you mentioned a couple of projects. Of course, the channels project, the big one. You also had what was the name of your migrations?
South,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, South, which got merged into Django, and you've been working on the Django core team for a while now, and so you have some experience with long-term projects and sustainably funding open source projects, which is always a hot button topic for us. Share a story with us. It looks like you've had a couple Django features which you've managed to get funded the development of. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, I've been unusually like lucky / well fortunate in that regard. Like, so the first thing I got money for, and one of the first open source funding things I actually heard of. So when South was still a third party app at the time, I wanted to merge it into Django, and that is a lot of work. It was actually basically a full rewrite of the code pretty much. And so I turned to Kickstarter and I went, okay, I need around £3,000 US pound, like I need about 3,000 UK pound sterling to pull this off. Like in my spare time, I had a day a week free. Like that, my freelance rate would add up to about that. And so I did a Kickstarter. So I'm like, hey, this is a single feature. There's a clear defined end goal of it's in Django. Would you like to give some money? And the response to that was overwhelmingly positive. I think I raised it almost £18,000.
Wow.
From a target of 2.5, I think it was. And so like I was very fortunate that the community really rallied behind that. And like that gave me the funding and the time to basically merge it in considerably faster than I would otherwise been able to. And like just spend some of my freelancing time directly on that stuff. And that was really nice. And so that was good for the South feature. And then for channels, there's a different approach. So Mozilla have a project called the Mozilla Open Source Support Grant System, MOSS for short. And what they do is Mozilla are doing this wonderful thing of giving money to open source projects that they rely on, which I wish every company really did, but that's an aside. And so I think it was Django Under the Hood last year. We were having a sort of informal meeting of core developers, and somebody went, "Oh yeah, there's this Mozilla thing that we should probably apply for." Like what, like for, and specifically the Mozilla thing was also for a new feature, something that you could specify and bound and say, "Okay, we're going to do this. This is the end goal. Here's a rough estimate of the time frame and the cost," and then apply. And so I sent an application, and we were very fortunate to get given the money, $150,000 US, which is a lot of money to know what to do with in many cases. And that was the estimate of the amount of work for both channels and also some Django REST framework integration to Django as well, sort of is still ongoing. And so that was also a sort of single lump sum raise, but from a company rather than from the public, although Mozilla is a very public thinking company in many ways. And so both of those, like I've been really honored to have the public and Mozilla both be happy and confident in my proposals and my work to pull those things off. And the channels money is more than sufficient to pay both, the time it takes to develop the main part of the project, but also we are paying individual developers for features. Like we have a list of big features on the GitHub issue tracker, and if you want to work on one, you can send in a small proposal. We have a small team of DSF and Django members who'll sort of vet it and make sure you have a relatively decent history, and then just approve you to work on it, and then we'll pay you your going daily rate to work on that stuff. And as a sustainable way of doing open source, I really like this. It's a way of saying we can pay you to do what you are normally paid to do and write good software. And I really, really like that as a way of doing this stuff. And we've already had I think 6 or 7 major features being paid for through this program, and we have a few more that I'm sort of trying to rustle up people to do. It's sometimes surprisingly hard to find people to pay money to, it turns out, but we're getting there. So that's been a really nice way of doing it.
Have you formalized the process much then, since you've done it so many times?
I mean, I've done it twice, so.
Oh, I thought you said 5.
Oh, you mean for the channel? Yes, no, we have a formalized channels one from the start. So we Django, as it grows as a project, we like having formal ways of doing things. So there's no skirting around the problem, or sort of, especially when money's involved, accusations of fraud or favoritism. So we have a neutral committee that I'm not on that approve that stuff, and there's a process where I work with the person to have a proposal. We put it to the committee, they discuss it, and then come up with the result, and then we have a separate sort of structure already for Django called the DSF, the Django Software Foundation. They handle the money and the payouts and stuff as well. Wow. So it's all very well formalized. I'm very happy with how above board and understandable it is. It's very hard to accuse us of favoritism in that respect.
It's an interesting way to do money raises, and I guess compare that to features in Ruby. If you even might know other languages, how do other people do what they do? Is it just free open source, just people's hard work, and there's no money, or what's generally the way other camps do it?
Well, I mean, this is the general problem in open source. Funding is a general problem in open source across the board. Not only in Django and Python. Obviously those features I mentioned were funded. 2 other things in the Django world have also been funded. So we had Postgres specific fields and stuff funded for Mark Tamlin. That was amazing. And we had Django REST framework stuff funded as well, both Kickstarters in those cases. But there's also a general problem of there are other Django features that are still done purely by volunteers. Our security team is still purely volunteers. Thankfully, we have a full-time paid Django fellow, and his job is to do all our bug triaging and keep things going, and it should be just keep things flowing and do security releases and that kind of stuff. But it's a general problem in open source. And one of the things I like to look at and consider is how do we keep open source as a whole community going? How do we fund all this software that the world really does rely on?
Certainly, yeah.
Nginx and other things are the core of an astonishing number of systems. Even Linux and Nginx, there are commercial branches to some of those people. Red Hat employs some kernel engineers. Nginx has a commercial arm, but there are a lot of other projects. OpenSSL was one of the most recent ones, right? There was a couple of people working on that, and they weren't really paid very much at all. And that library is one of the most critical parts of security infrastructure we have in the world. And in general, I'm trying to help, I guess not raise awareness so much as trying to work out what is a more sustainable solution for ongoing maintenance. What I did was raising money for a single feature that you can define, and you say this is what we're doing. It's got a bounded time. It finishes by this date. But in general, you need money for fixing security holes and doing code audits and keeping things maintained properly and looking at issues and all the stuff that it seems very plain on the surface, and no one wants to fund it individually, but it's still a very important part of maintaining good software. And that's really what I'm interested in, for Django especially, because that's what I'm involved in, but also in the general sphere, how can we get a pattern of that works well?
Well, I guess before we close the show, though, maybe give some advice. You had a successful Kickstarter. You've done this at least a couple times. You've thought about ways to formalize it. Give people that are listening to this show some advice, ways to replicate some successes you've had, whether it's that Kickstarter or other models you're thinking of. What are some ways that other open source camps can replicate what you've done well?
Yeah, that's a good question. In some ways it's tricky. The South migrations one in particular was very much a time and place thing. I had been working on that project for 7-ish years at that point, unpaid. And so I see that one more as a pressure relief of like people have been using it for so long that they very fortunately came out and said, oh no, we've already used this. We know it's good. We're going to pay you money in retrospect. In a way is what happened. But I think also part of it was like being very clear about like what you're trying to accomplish, I think was very important. And also like giving something that people wanted. Like it's bad advice for what I just said about like maintenance and that kind of stuff. But like, you know, at the end of the day, open source needs some PR. It needs some like advertising and business logic. Like you need to understand how to make people want to give you money, be it businesses who have a different set of reasons to individuals, but like both of them, you have to appeal to them on their own level. Like find the things that businesses want, find the things that people care about and appeal to those. Like if enterprises want like support contracts or stability, maybe you can frame the conversation around like, well, you can pay for a support contract that actually funds all the security stuff. If individuals want a new feature that sounds really exciting, maybe you could frame it around that new feature. But like you still need to consider that you're still appealing to people and business with their own opinions and their own thoughts. And that's why you've got to really like think about your writing and what you're saying and make sure, and you know, people
who are you focusing though? Are you focusing on businesses? You focus on the general public at that point? In a Kickstarter's general public, so.
Well, not just, but it's not though. So the Kickstarter I did, over half the money was on the high-end tiers from big companies, right?
Okay.
So like it had this cross appeal, but it really depends on the software. Like if you're writing like, you know, archiving and checking software, that's probably more a business thing. If you're writing like exciting like home automation software, that might be more personal. But it really depends. And like,
yeah,
it's unfortunate that like both times I've done this, I've had the advantage of, and it's definitely a sort of almost unfair advantage of, I have a good history of implementing things. And like people go, oh yes, that's Andrew. He's pretty trustworthy with this stuff. Like we know he understands it. And even with Channels, I came in with like, you know, I'd spent a year working on prototypes. I had working code at that point. And so I'm sure that helped swing at least a little bit, like coming in with some work already done. And that's not necessarily sustainable. Like it is a privilege to have free time to work on open source in the first place. And I would love to find a way of fixing that dichotomy of like, we shouldn't just have people who have the privilege of like not having children or not having partners or whatever, how there's time to work on open source. And if the only answer is you have to come to the table with something in the first place, that's still not really helping that. It helps certainly, but it's not solving that problem.
Yeah.
And so like I had like an unfair leg up in that situation.
Well, before we close out, is there anything that we didn't get to ask you about Django, Python, channels, the community, documentation first, different things that are tried and true for the community you're a part of? Anything you want to say?
So I'm going to put in here a really good word for the Python community, because I came to Python in 2006 and I am still a very proud member of that community because of the level of friendliness and help and outreach and just niceness that you get from all parts of the community. Like, you know, especially in the last few years, it's made great strides in being more opening and welcoming as well. And like going to PyCon, going to DjangoCon, like they're just great places to go. And so like, I would say like, if you run an open source project, I would advise you, don't just consider the technical part of a project, but the community is a really important part of it as well. Like have positive discussions, welcome people, especially beginners. Like beginners are your lifeblood of an open source project. Like a beginner today is a core developer tomorrow, right? Like welcome people and try and help develop them as people. And like that, if we all did that, I think the world would be a better place for open source.
On that note, I have to mention requests for commits, because we've been talking about drive-by contributions, contributor onboarding, all sorts of things on that show. It's the human side of code. It's about sustainably running open source, forming open source, businesses and licensing, all those fun things around it. So, you know, to you, Andrew, if you haven't listened to it yet, go to changelog.com/RFC. You'll find the show there, or the vanity URL, rfc.com, or sorry, it's .fm, rfc.s. I can't even get it out.
You can do it.
rfc.fm. I promise I got it right. It's been a blast producing that show. We actually just did a show that's coming out soon with Brendan Ike, and I'm not even kidding you, for like an hour and plus a little bit, we got like the history of the internet and how we got here in terms of browsers and motivations from companies like Google and Microsoft and others, Mozilla, of course, but he couldn't talk much about that because obvious reasons why. But a great history, not only of like the role JavaScript played in it, but how open source has been funded or is being funded, and living based on this history of browsers. So that's a great show to listen to on that note of what you just mentioned there. But that's all we have for today's show. Anything else you want to mention? Any last minute shout outs?
No, if you're interested in channels, go to channels.readthedocs.io. And if you're interested in Django, go to djangoproject.com. There's plenty of documentation of both those to look at, and we'd love to have you come and work on stuff.
Cool. All right, with that, let's call this show done and say goodbye.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Andrew. Bye.